Hello, everyone. Might make a start now. Welcome to this ACUR at ANU student poster presentation session titled Complex Problems Visualized. We acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet and pay our respects to the elders past, present, and future. My name is Diana and I will be chairing today's session. And our first presenter for today is T. O'Donnell. T, please start when you're ready.
I'm not able to share my screen, Diana. It says that screen sharing has been disabled.
Screen sharing has been disabled. Oh, would you like to email that to me quickly? I will send you my email address and I can share the screen. I'll send that email address through to our other speakers as well.
You might be able to disable it if you click share screen. I think it gives you options to let participants share.
Oh, thank you. I forgot that I was the host. Thank you. Beautiful. Is that working now? Lovely. Thank you for that. Isla, was it?
Okay, so I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians on the land on which we're meeting today and on which this study was conducted, the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri land. I'd like to acknowledge the elders past, present, and emerging, and also acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. So before beginning this research, I understood that there were two universals that people experience despite their culture and society: birth and death. However, just because these are experienced by everyone, this doesn't mean that they're experienced equally. So I chose to focus on death because I don't really like children or birth. We may have come across obituaries before, whether it be an obituary of a celebrity or perhaps a loved one you have lost. You may have also come across a coronial inquest in the past, perhaps not in a newspaper like you would with an obituary, as they're no longer published, but on the news about a mysterious or unnatural death, whether it be as a murder or something. So during my initial scoping for this research, I came across the British Library archives of newspapers and found the Stanford Mercury, which I will be referring to as the Stanford from now. So the Stanford is one of the oldest still publishing newspapers in England, and with the first article published in 1714. For a little bit of context, Stanford is a small village in Lincolnshire County. And so then I had to choose my kind of time period that I wanted to research. I've always been interested in the 19th century experience of death, as British Victorians are often considered to be death obsessed, thanks to Queen Victoria's long period of mourning after the death of Prince Consort Albert. This then helped narrow down the time period that I would be researching, as there was a lot of background literature and things that I could refer to. So I decided to focus on the early Victorian period, from 1801 to 1842, as there was some really interesting legislation about reporting deaths that came into effect during that time. So we had the Registration Act from 1836, which basically said that all deaths, regardless of the class of the person, had to be reported to the registrar. And we also had the Medical Witnesses Act from 1837, which was about coroners bringing in medical witnesses. So according to the Great British Census of 1852, during this period, Stanford had a population of roughly 5,000 people. So it's a small, quaint village, but had one of the biggest and longest continuing newspapers. So had a high literacy rate as well. So now I've got the time period and my data source. I needed to determine a theoretical lens. I've often questioned why only some people are spoken about when they die, as well as the different elements that contribute to this. There's also the questions of, are there some patterns of this and reasons for this? So then through these questions, I decided that Michel Foucault's repressive hypothesis was the best theory for me to use. And also because I kind of like to make my life hard with Michel Foucault. So Foucault formally introduced this theory in his first volume of The History of Sexuality. He hypothesized that discourse, also referred to as knowledge, was produced by a select few individuals. He called this the hierarchy of knowledge power. These individuals also controlled the kind of knowledge that was produced and created. And as you may have guessed by the title of his book, he did this by looking at Victorian sexuality. So then I decided to apply it to death. Now I have the components that I need to begin this research, and I decided for my method that I'd be using a critical discourse analysis. So I found that there were certain values and categories that kept coming up in the over 600 obituaries and over 50 coronial inquest reports that I analyzed and coded. Gender was always mentioned, and so was the location that where the person lived and also where they died. Age, occupation, religion, and community were also extremely important based on these documents. This then led to the development of my very own hierarchy of death. So as you may remember from like a minute or so ago, Foucault made a hierarchy of knowledge power for sexuality. So I decided to make one for death. And I just made this graphic a little bit bigger so that you can see as I'm talking. So here we can see that there is a spectrum from ideal to deviant, as well as the overall 3 categories that I found were made clear that they were really important based on the obituaries and coronial inquests. So from left to right, we have the most ideal in the orange, dying at home, and then in the middle, accidental deaths. Sometimes they just happen, and then in blue to the right of the screen, what was like really bad, really deviant, suicide and murder. So these were then influenced by the main organizing axes or principles, which were community, family, kinship, the stuff that I spoke about earlier, and autonomy, the individual's behavior. There was some differences that I found though between inquisitions, coronial inquest reports, and obituaries. Obituaries tended to provide information in a fairly straightforward manner, where they gave the name of the person, their age at which they died, and then their occupation. Whereas inquisition served to kind of moralize these unnatural deaths, sometimes by going into extremely graphic detail, and going further into the biographies of the person who'd either died or committed the death or witnessed the death. The one thing that they had in common though, was that they were all written by white men. Here we can come back to the repressive hypothesis and the hierarchy of knowledge power over death, as Foucault spoke about. Who is controlling and writing these knowledges and presenting them to the public? We see that the hierarchy is specifically controlled by journalists and coroners, men, who then determine what kind of death is ideal to deviant. They also manage the commemoration of individuals who have the obituaries published about them. For example, dead rich men tended to have longer obituaries, that went into more detail about their accomplishments and sometimes their salaries, which was a bit weird. Whereas a woman was only written about because of the direct tie to her husband, brother, or father. If she was a deviant woman, though, her obituary might be longer to profess how weird she was. An example I came across was the widow who didn't remarry for over 30 years and lived alone with 6 cats. So to kind of conclude and sum up, I found that through this hierarchy, I was able to see and answer those questions about why were only some people written about? Why did this happen? Unfortunately, I only did this through the 40-year period that I was able to, partially because I had about 680 something obituaries that I had read by then, and I needed to get a wriggle on with my thesis. We also found that this hierarchy could potentially be used to look at other deaths from different time periods. And those are the kind of future directions that I'd like to go with my research. Yes, and any questions or comments?
Thank you, T.
Sorry.
Yes, I'll open the floor for questions from judges. So I'll set a timer for 5 minutes. Judges, do you have any questions?
Yeah, that was really interesting. You were saying that you had collected these obituaries over a long time span. Were there any changes in gender and reporting of deviancy over time, or did it remain constant?
Oh, sorry, I kind of missed the middle part of that question, Barnaby.
That's all right. Were there changes in gender descriptions in obituaries over time, or did it remain relatively constant across your time?
It remained relatively constant. I think if I applied the same kind of study to, and ideally at the beginning of my honors thesis, this is what I wanted to do, which was to go all the way to now, because Stanford Mercury is still publishing. But my supervisor advised against that. And also time was kind of like a big factor, but there weren't that many changes in terms of gender. I did find that it was fairly equal in reporting though, which I was a bit surprised at. Not early on. So from 1801, there are only about 3 obituaries that were published. And then when the Registration Act came into play, then we had more obituaries because more people were being registered as dead. So in that sense, it did change, but overall, not necessarily.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, do you mind, T, if I ask you a question?
Oh, go.
I was curious as to your kind of your point about the obituaries, as you noted, being rather kind of matter of fact and straightforward, and the kind of inquests you suggested tended to be far more moralizing. I wondered if you had any kind of thoughts as to why that is. I mean, is it just a matter of length, or is it a matter of a kind of different audience that they're going for, or did you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I found that it was primarily because of the audience. So coroners, and this also had to do with the role of the coroner in society. So they were elected officials from the public. So the public elected primarily someone of higher status and stance, so who was normally on his way to being a knight or a lawyer or something like that. And so then they had this kind of moral authority already embedded within their social stance and social status. And then from there, like, for example, with the accidental deaths, there would be moralization of the witness. So if it was a child who caught on fire, playing, the woman who witnessed the death would be the one who was labeled as deviant. They're like, oh, the caretaker didn't take care of this child. And that would be that. So there was definitely that aspect of moralization about this is what you shouldn't do and this is what you should try to do. And I think that was because, and it still is the case today, coronial inquests to investigate the unnatural deaths, and those were considered unnatural.
Thank you. Is that the end of the questions, judges? Lovely. All right, since we have a minute left, if anyone from the audience would like to ask a quick question, feel free to type something in the Q&A section. I'll give 10 to 15 seconds.
While people are doing that, maybe I can just fill in with another just question that you may have addressed in your talk, actually. But why the Stanford Mercury?
To be honest, I just kind of came across it when I was just scrolling through the British archive of newspapers, and it just looked quite interesting. And then when I clicked on one of them, so I did an initial search with some keywords, and then when I just clicked on the Stanford Mercury, I did a little bit of Googling and like went down that research rabbit hole, where I found that it was the longest publishing, like still publishing newspaper in England. And I thought, oh, that's really cool. And so then I chose it.
Lovely, thank you. We have run out of time actually, but we didn't have any questions from the audience. So thank you, T, for your presentation. I would now like to introduce our second presenter, Tawanrat Marit. Please start when you're ready. Are you there, Tawanrat? I feel like there might have been some tech issues.
She appears frozen to me.
She appears frozen to me as well. Isla, would you be okay to present now? So we'll give a chance for Tawanrat to sort out the tech issues. Thank you.
Can you guys see that full screen? And can you see my mouse? Hi, my name is Isla Ford, and today I am presenting my research, which is titled The Relationship Between Self-Efficacy and Performance in a Statistics Subject Among University Students, a Systematic Literature Review and Meta-Analyses. So, statistics is a mandatory subject for many disciplines at a university level. Some examples include psychology, education, engineering, social work, business, and nursing, just to name a few. Statistics units teach fundamental skills in research design and data analyses, which facilitate evidence-based practice. So for example, statistics units teach students how to critically analyse research, in particular the results section, the methodology. It also lays down the foundations for people to be able to conduct their own research within the future. However, students tend to report low levels of self-efficacy for statistics units. Self-efficacy refers to an individual's belief in their ability to succeed in relation to a specific task. So in more simpler terms, students tend to report low levels of confidence in their ability to learn and apply statistical knowledge. Literature has demonstrated that self-efficacy can have a powerful influence on behaviour and mood. In particular, research has shown that self-efficacy is related to academic performance. So most commonly, there are research articles suggesting that low levels of self-efficacy are related to low levels of academic achievement. However, currently there is no published meta-analyses analysing the relationship between self-efficacy and performance within statistics in particular. Alongside this, there is conflicting evidence regarding the self-efficacy of postgraduate students. So within the theory of self-efficacy, it's suggested that postgraduate students have higher levels of self-efficacy. This is usually because they've already conducted statistics units in their undergraduate degree. as well as they're usually the top performing undergraduate students. So it suggested their self-efficacy levels are higher, but there is little known if this relationship between self-efficacy and achievement is different for graduate students compared to undergraduate students. So the aims of my research were to, number one, estimate the strengths of the relationship between self-efficacy and performance in university statistics units. And a sub-aim of this was to establish if the relationship was different for undergraduate students compared to postgraduate students. Systematic searches were conducted on PsycInfo, ERIC and Academic Search Complete databases on the 11th of April 2021. Papers were included if they A, reported the relationship between self-efficacy and achievement in a statistics subject, B, used a sample of university students, C, were initially published in English or translated into English, and D, were peer-reviewed journal articles. So effect sizes were extracted from eligible studies and meta-analysed. So from the database searches, there was a total of 930 articles, 815 following deduplication. 21 of these articles were found to meet the full eligibility criteria, which I just outlined before. 20 of these studies used a Pearson's correlation to report the effect size, and one did not. And this one that didn't report a Pearson's correlation didn't report an effect size that could be transferred into a Pearson's correlation. So it wasn't included in the meta-analyses, but was in the systematic review. So 20 studies were meta-analysed, 21 systematically reviewed. So a little brief snippet of what the systematic review showed. The majority of studies reported a significant relationship between self-efficacy and performance in statistics, with 16 showing significance and only 5 not finding any significant relationship. A majority of the included studies used a sample of undergraduate students rather than postgraduate students, so only 4 of the included studies contained postgraduate students. Half of the studies containing postgraduate students did not report a significant relationship between self-efficacy and performance in statistics. There was no eligibility required behind the disciplines used, so any discipline could be included. However, psychology was the most common discipline used as a sample for the studies, with none of the studies just using psychology students. Interestingly, only one study reported a mediating or moderating variable, whereby it was found that the relationship between self-efficacy and achievement was mediated by attendance in peer-assisted study sessions. So onto the meta-analysis. The random effects model found a significant, moderate and positive estimated aggregate effect size for the relationship between self-efficacy and achievement in a statistics subject, with the Pearson's correlation being 0.35, with a significance level of p less than 0.001. So down the bottom here, we have figure 1, whereby that is a forest plot of all of the included studies. So the blue dot there represents each individual study and the effect size that they reported, with the black lines being their confidence intervals. And down the bottom you have the green line, which is the meta-analysed confidence intervals, and the green dot being the effect size found in the meta-analysis. So all of the included studies reported a positive correlation, which can be seen in this graph. Alongside that, most of them reported between about a 0.20 and 0.6 correlation, which is pretty much most of them reporting a positive and moderate correlation between these variables. So on to the subgroup analyses. For postgraduate students, the aggregated effect size for relationship between self-efficacy and performance in a statistics subject was non-significant. However, for undergraduate students, the effect size was significant, with a Pearson's correlation of 0.36, which is quite similar to the one we found overall anyway, obviously a little bit higher because those non-significant postgraduate studies were not included. So another important factor in the meta-analysis was to check for publication bias. This is due to the fact that quite often journals will publish significant findings over non-significant findings. So as you can see in figure 2, we looked into publication bias through the use of a funnel plot. So what you want is a funnel plot to appear quite symmetrical. So those blue dots represent all the studies included, and you want it to be so the same amount on the left-hand side as there are on the right-hand side. So this funnel plot appears slightly asymmetrical to the right-hand side with a few more studies over there. So using the linear trim and fill analyses by Jewell and Tweedy, it is suggested that 4 studies were potentially missing due to publication bias. The adjusted effect size was measured at Fisher's Z to be 0.33, which is quite similar to the 0.36 we had in the results anyway, and it still is a significant positive and moderate correlation. So publication bias wasn't really an issue within this study. This is also demonstrated from the Edgar's regression test, as it was found that there was a non-significance indicating that publication bias was unlikely to be present in the current meta-analyses. So overall, self-efficacy is positively correlated with performance in undergraduate statistics units. These findings shed light on why many students underperform in statistics subjects and may help lecturers provide interventions where necessary, as it's providing evidence into this relationship that low levels of self-efficacy can be related to low levels of academic achievement. So by showing this, it gives them the ability to put their time and funding into interventions to improve students' levels of self-efficacy. Alongside this, interventions to improve self-efficacy are best aimed at undergraduate students, as no relationship was found for postgraduate students. However, it's really important to note that in this circumstance, as I pointed out before, the major difference in sample sizes, which could be a factor leading to the significant and non-significant findings. However, it is in line with the theory regarding self-efficacy, as it's suggested that postgraduate students tend to start with that high level of self-efficacy, and it sort of reaches a ceiling effect where the relationship doesn't really matter anymore. Well, isn't really significant anymore. So future research needs to be conducted to assess the effectiveness on these interventions to improve levels of self-efficacy, as well as future research really needs to look into this relationship in further detail, because as I said before, only one study reported a mediating or moderating variable. So little is known about what other factors influence this relationship. Thanks for listening, and I'll open up for questions.
Thank you, Isla. Yes, so if our judges have any questions, I invite them to ask them now.
Isla, thanks for that. Sorry, did I talk over you, Barnaby?
All good, I can wait.
All good. I had a question related to your conclusions and implications, but particularly when you say that these findings may help to help lecturers to provide interventions where necessary. I guess, forgive me if this is a silly question, but what might those interventions be? What would you perceive those kind of interventions to be effective in boosting self-efficacy and confidence?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So this is my this is my literature review research. I'm currently conducting my empirical research in my honours degree, which is looking into the interventions to improve self-efficacy. So we're conducting a vicarious experience intervention whereby we've got past students, so that completed statistics unit the year before, come in and speak to the students, talk about their struggles, their worries, and how ultimately they're still able to succeed. So it was pretty much just old students talking to the new students about you can get through this. It's not as hard as you think it's going to be, if that makes sense.
Well, I actually have been lecturing statistics to undergraduates in psychology for the last couple of years. Their anxiety levels are pretty high.
Oh, sorry, Dr. Barnaby Dixon. Unfortunately, your audio is cutting in and out. Would you be able to type your question in the chat?
Yeah, no worries. Am I still coming in and out now?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Oh, okay, hang on.
But it was floating in and out.
Okay.
Sorry
So
about that.
yeah, I'll ask it and you tell me if I'm gone. How do you operationalize self-efficacy? And are you controlling for anxiety in any of these studies?
Yeah, so that was one of the major issues we found, is that a lot of the time people were looking at anxiety without looking at self-efficacy. So most of the time, that's why we found barely any mediating and moderating variables, because it was usually a sub-aim of people's research. They were looking at anxiety as, anxiety and grades pretty much. In my current study we're doing, we are looking at both anxiety and self-efficacy and seeing if there's any mediation moderating effects like that. In regards to how we operationalize self-efficacy, it's quite difficult. There is heaps of different measures that are used. So everyone chooses their own measure, they sort of do what they want, and they're not really, reliability and validity is sort of iffy. So a lot of the studies we used have heaps of different measures, which was a huge issue with our findings, and there was a large amount of heterogeneity. But there are scales out there that have been found to be more reliable than others. It usually just depends on the length, but most of them are asking just how people feel towards anxiety, what their confidence levels are, towards statistics, what their confidence levels are and things like that. But in saying that, the reliability and validity of the scales is very iffy.
You could maybe fit that into the analysis. If any differences come out.
Yeah, I tried to do a subgroup analysis on all the different scales, but since there was out of the 21 studies, I think there was 10 different scales. So there's only 2 studies in each subgroup. So we really couldn't look into it, yeah.
Do our judges have any other questions? We have 1 minute left. Oh, lovely. Since we're running a couple minutes behind time, I might not take questions from the audience anymore, so that we don't go over time. So that brings us to the end of Isla's presentation. I've adjusted the speaking order to account for technical interruptions. So I invite Emma Lin to present now, and then we'll have Tawanrat present forth. So whenever you're ready, Emma.
Can everyone see my poster?
Yes.
So hello everyone, my name is Emma and today I'm presenting the ACT Local Hospitality Business in COVID-19, the impact from the reduction in Chinese international students. The COVID-19 pandemic is the most important current topic that has the entire world focused, as it has changed so many aspects of our daily lives, economic development, and international relations, including in Australia. As the Chinese international student myself, I am particularly interested in the impact it has to international students in the ACT and its links to the local economic development. By studying the change in local businesses performers in the hospitality sector, especially Chinese restaurants, due to the border closure and a reduction in the numbers of onshore international students, I wish to demonstrate the significant contribution international students have to regional economic growth and provide solutions to this new change and new economic environment post-pandemic. There are 3 key findings in my research. Chinese international students' arrival number decreased in the ACT during 2020. The international student contribution rate contributed greatly to the regional economic growth, especially in hospitality sector. Hence, the hospitality sector in the ACT was not performing well at the beginning of the pandemic, and its income decreased more than average of all the retailing sectors. According to the data from the Australian Government Department of Home Affairs, I analysed the overseas arrival and departure data from July 2018 to December 2020, particularly the visitors for educational purposes from China in the ACT, shown in the first graph in the poster. Normally during first and third quarter of the year, which include the start of each semester, there were around 5,000 students arriving. Even during the second and fourth quarter, which is during the semester, it was still around 1,500 people arriving. However, since March 2020, after the border closure in Australia, the arriving number dropped to equal or less than 5 each quarter. This is more than 99% decrease, which is enormous and highly significant. It's likely that the number will increase slowly post-pandemic with the uncertain international travel policy. Students believe that their experience of studying abroad and living abroad reduced dramatically due to the border closure and online classes. Students begin to seek alternative countries such as UK, America, or nearby Asian countries where the borders are open. Using the data from Australia Bureau of Statistic, I analysed the ACT local hospitality sector performance by looking at their retail turnover from July 2018 to January 2021. As we can easily tell from the second graph in the poster, there was a big drop in the cafe, restaurant, and catering service from March 2020, which recovered in July. In comparison, the turnover of total retail is much smoother. I then calculated the coefficient of variation ratio. This ratio provides information of the data volatility. For the hospitality sector, this is 0.2162, and the overall retail coefficient of variation is 0.1178. Other sectors such as household goods retailing and supermarket and grocery store also have a lower coefficient of variation, which was 0.1739 and 0.0827 respectively. This indicates that the turnover of the hospitality sector in the ACT varies more than other sectors. With the quantitative data analysis above, it gives us a clear picture of how the student numbers and income of businesses have changed. The quantitative analysis gives a clear and convincing trend. However, since there are many factors that could influence the performance of hospitality businesses, the volatile data mentioned above for the turnover in cafe, restaurant, and catering services cannot necessarily be explained by only one factor like the number of international students. In addition, we are interested in the performance of local restaurants with large international student customer base in particular. But the data of small section is difficult to obtain from any existing database. The arrival of international students has a quarterly related trend since it's only peaked at the beginning of each semester, while the restaurant income should be more stable throughout the year. It will be very difficult to find strong links between these two factors. Therefore, qualitative analysis also plays an important part in the research. In addition to secondary qualitative research, I also conduct interviews and survey to local businesses in the ACT in May this year to seek for their opinions for how much Chinese students contributed to their businesses and how they coped with the pandemic impact. Overall, businesses made an effort to cope with losing customers, but the outcomes are not enough to cover their losses compared to the revenue before COVID. 67% of the businesses indicate that their current revenue hasn't recovered to pre-COVID levels, even though 70% of them received a subsidy such as JobKeeper or rental price reduction. And when asked what was the biggest challenge for them to improve their revenue, all of them respond with lack of customer, especially international students. Literature review of the international students similar local economy has shown evidence of a positive contribution within Australia and even worldwide, such as in the UK and Spain. With the dramatic decrease in number in the international student during the post-COVID-19, the local economy must have suffered a significant margin from it. In fact, the hospitality sector might have been one of the most heavily suffering industry due to the reduction in Chinese international students, especially Chinese cuisine restaurants. A study in Chinese international students' food consumptions shows that students studying abroad tend to prefer their home meal since it's familiar to them, especially when they're first in a new country. In addition, they're less likely to cook at home compared to other groups of people These students are usually new to an independent life and having hard time to adapt with a busy study schedule. From the research I have conducted, I formed some recommendations. For the government, the more welcoming study environment and opening borders sends to a positive signal to international students that Australia is an ideal destination for studying abroad. A longer and more stable subsidy can help businesses recover in the long term, and with a good vaccination rate, encouraging interstate travel, which can also bring businesses new customers. For universities in the ACT, a more reasonable tuition fee is the most direct factor to attract international students, as tuition expenditure is a large amount of a student's family. It might not bring quick short-term benefit to the university, but it can help bring more students in the long run and hence help with the local economic recovery. Universities should promote not only to the students, but to their parents. Parents usually care about the safety of their children, emphasizing Canberra is a very safe city to live in with very low crime rate, as well as very little COVID cases and a well-developed medical system. Instead of competing with each other, universities should work together to promote international studies to save costs and increase influences. And finally, for local businesses, adapting menu to local people's taste and promotion on social media to get in touch with young people living in the ACT are major factors helping businesses attract alternative customer group to alleviate losing Chinese international customers. The decreasing number of Chinese students poses a challenge to many local businesses in the ACT. As businesses actively respond to this challenge, there is still a long way before the performance go back to normal. With the rapidly increases in the vaccination rate, the COVID-19 pandemic seems to be getting better, but the economic impact will stay for a longer period. However, with the government, universities, and local businesses working together, there will be a bright future for economic recovery. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you for your presentation. I'll now open the floor up for judges to ask questions. You have 5 minutes, judges.
First, is my audio okay?
Yes, it's good for now. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So in Canberra, my understanding is that big proportion of the.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you very well.
Sorry, I'll ask it really quickly. How much does the university, in terms of student body, contribute to the hospitality industry compared to other strata, socioeconomic strata?
Yeah, so that's the biggest problem when I during my research is that I can't really have a statistical analysis on that because, like I explained, that we can't really find the data that can run, for example, a regression analysis to see exactly how much. That's why I did a lot of qualitative analysis by doing surveys and interviews. And from my interview results, I would say around, it says on the poster, around 70% of the businesses that I surveyed and interviewed said that they believe that losing Chinese students is the major factor for them to, is a major concern for them to not be able to recover from the normal business performers.
Fair enough, thanks.
Emma, thank you for another excellent presentation. I'm just thinking about I share your hope for a brighter future. I think we could all use some hope at this time in this country. But I'm looking at your recommendations there and, governments and universities specifically. And these seem to me to be fairly interrelated to one another in that, you know, the government is increasingly, our national government is increasingly stripping funding from the university sector, which then in turn leads to higher international student fees. So I'm wondering, just on a kind of practical level, like what would you perceive the government to be doing in a practical sense in order to foster a welcoming environment for international students?
I would say that having a large subsidy towards educational sectors is very important, because I believe the university shouldn't just run entirely like a business based on revenue and profit, and that would sort of decrease the effectiveness of their education quality. So by having a heavily subsidized industry, which I hope, I'm not sure what the government will think of it, that it will help university to focus more on increasing their teaching quality, bringing a better environment for the student, more opening environment, instead of just think about, okay, if I don't increase the tuition fee, I might not be able to pay all the teachers, and that would just bring a very bad environment for both students and the staff in the university.
Lovely. Judges, do we have any more questions? There's time for one quick question if there's any left. Lovely. Thank you for your presentation, Emma. Now I would like to introduce our final presenter, Tawanrat Marit. If I could get Emma, you to stop sharing your screen, please. Thank you. And you can start whenever you're ready, Tawanrat.
Do you see the screen now?
Yes, if you zoom in a bit more, that would be good. Yeah, perfect.
I would like to apologize for the technical issue earlier. And the topic of my research is economic, social, and cultural rights of the indigenous peoples in Thailand. And so let's take a look at the introduction first. For the background, in Thailand, there are 5 million of the indigenous peoples, which is accountable for 7.2% of the total population. And there are at least 30 ethnic groups, which are considered as the indigenous peoples as well in Thailand, but they are the minorities and being considered as the marginalized because they have experienced the human rights deprivation and restrictions, especially to the land ownership and public services. Because of their legal status, many of them still are considered as the stateless persons. And for the aim of this study, I would like to identify the policy gaps regarding human rights situations among the indigenous group in Thailand, especially on the aspect of the economic, social, and cultural rights by using United Nations Human Rights Framework. For the hypothesis, I argue that the human rights violation of the indigenous peoples in Thailand is mainly because of the lack of the understanding and the knowledge about their culture and backgrounds, and this can be seen and reflected in the policy implementations toward the indigenous groups in Thailand. For the methodology, I collected the data from the DEX research mostly, and most of them are comes from the international and local NGOs, as well as the researchers who are working closely with the indigenous groups in Thailand. And specifically, I will use the case study of the Karen people from Bangla village of the Gangraja National Park, Phetchaburi province, as well as the Morgan people in the southern Thailand, specifically in Phuket and Krabi province. And my analysis is mostly based on UN frameworks of human rights, specifically to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Declaration on the Rights of the Indigenous Peoples, and the International Convention on the Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, or the ICESCR. So let's take a look at the key findings. I divided the findings into two parts. The first part, I will discuss about the root cause of the problem, which is related to the historical context and background. The second part, I will talk about the impacts on, especially on the case study of the current of Kankrajang National Park and the Morgan people in Krabi and Phuket provinces. For the historical background, it has started with the emergence of nation-state idea in Southeast Asia, which is around 19th century. And this has created the notion of being Thai and being others in Thailand. And the notion still carry out throughout the history, along with the attempt to build the national identity and creating the ideal Thainess, especially during the Cold War period. And this idea, in fact, excluded the indigenous groups from the mainstream narrative, and they have become even more marginalized since their culture and background are quite different from the mainstream narrative that adopted by the state. And the situation of indigenous peoples has even worsened when the National Forest Act of 1964 has introduced, and the state has prohibited any people from living in the forest area, and no one should enter the forest without the authority permission. So basically, the forest area has become state property, and this has become a problem because it's quite highly contradict with the livelihood of the indigenous peoples in Thailand, as they live in the forest for many generations, even before this law has been passed. But still the policy has been carried out until nowadays, which resulted in the forcible eviction of the indigenous groups, and the indigenous peoples also experience the legal harassment. They often have they are being charged for forest encroachment, and they're even experiencing dehumanized and harassment from the authorities as well. For the impact of economic, social, and cultural rights violation, according to the ICESCR, there are several rights that being violated due to the land eviction. Specifically are the right to land ownership, right to self-determination, and right to culture. So because they lose their ancestral lands and their property often destroyed during the process of eviction, they also cannot practice their culture, beliefs, and tradition that are often entrenched with the land in the forest, as well as they are forced to leave their ancestral lands and kind of being forced to adjust to the new lifestyle outside the forest confines. And that is not by their choice at all. And the situation become even worse because the authority often did not provide the proper resettlement for them. For the case of the current from Kankrajang National Park, there are 180 of them that experienced the land eviction, and the new resettlement given to them have very poor soil conditions and the lack of water resource for farming and plantation, which is the important part for their survival. And for the case of the Morgan people in southern Thailand, they experienced living under the crowded conditions in the new resettlement, which is around 45 families having to live in the small areas. And for some cases of Morgan people who are evicted by the because of the land dispute with the private entities, there was no resettlement provided for them at all. And land eviction of the indigenous peoples caused them to be in the economically vulnerable situation, specifically being in the poverty and being in debt because they cannot find jobs, opportunity that give them stable income or to adjust to the new lifestyle outside the forest, because most of them do not have proper education degree since they have very different lifestyle before in the forest. And also they do not speak Thai fluently because they have their own language. And this is very important because if you want to find some job in Thailand, you have to speak Thai fluently. And by not speaking the language, they often being discriminated for like having a decent jobs. For the proposed solutions, first of all, I suggest that Thai government must comply with the international laws and standards, specifically to the International Bill of Human Rights, as well as the Declaration on the Rights of the Indigenous Peoples. And these are the conventions and treaties that Thai government have ratified. Therefore, the state itself has the obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill the rights, even though they are the indigenous peoples or the marginalized group in the country. The second point, I would like to suggest the government to revise the National Forest Act of 1964 in order to make it accordance with the livelihoods of the indigenous peoples, as well as looking at the research from many organizations proving that the indigenous groups are living in harmony with the nature in the forest, and they do not causing any harm at all. And if they improve the understanding of livelihood of the indigenous people, it would be better to form the policies. I would like to also to suggest that the government must consider alternative evidence for proving nationality for the indigenous peoples, because in order to own the land in Thailand, you must have like the Thai nationality, and this link with the right to land ownership of the indigenous people, and it can be done by using the anthropological evidence for the case of indigenous groups. And lastly, I would like to suggest that Thai government should develop synergies with local and international NGOs, as well as the network of the indigenous groups, as they have the data and evidence that will be beneficial for policy implementation toward the indigenous peoples in Thailand. And yeah, that's it for my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Tawanrat. Congratulations. Now I'll open the floor to judges to ask some questions.
Tawanrat, thank you for another excellent paper, a very sobering paper. I wonder, I guess my question is one of hope. How hopeful are you that your kind of proposed solutions and certainly the kind of Thai government actually, you know, adhering to the values that they have ratified? Are you hopeful that this is possible? Is there anything to suggest that this is a kind of current concern?
To be honest, even though I propose that the Thai government should comply with international law and standard, but I would say it's quite authoritarian government right now, and there also needs the like international pressure to push on Thai government as well, because I think one weakness of Thai government is if there's any international pressure, it would be more like, you know, they would like to comply when there are a lot of pressure.
I was wondering, when you were saying that there's land evictions, what are the reasons for land eviction? Just that there's some rights that the government can pull and just remove without explanation?
For land eviction,
Yeah.
the main reason is because it's in the law, the National Reserve Forest Act. It doesn't allow any people to live inside the forest, because the government hold the idea that human will only like destroy the nature, and that quite contradict with the livelihoods of the indigenous peoples. And for the specific case of the Bangloy villager or the Karen people in the Gangraja National Park, because the government aimed to promote this as a World Heritage, and it in fact has declared as the World Heritage a few months ago, but it's still over the land dispute with the human rights issue. And for the Morgan people in Southern Ireland, these people do not have like identity card, and they do not have like the document paper to say that they have the ownership over the land, and often they are evicted because the private entities claim the ownership over the land. So for the Morgan, they have like different case where the court ordered them to be evicted, but mostly because the government still have like the idea that no one should be living inside the forest. Yeah.
Do we have any other questions from the judges? No? Well, lovely. I might get you to stop sharing your screen, Tawanrat. Thank you. Thank you to everyone for your presentations. They were very wonderful presentations. And thank you to our judges, Dr. Barnaby Dixon and Dr. Ben Eldridge. This recording will be made available online following the conference, and we hope to see you in our other conference sessions today. Looking forward to the award ceremony tonight. I'll stay back in case anyone has any questions, but you're free to leave when you wish.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.